Nina paused, wiping her hands on her apron as she moved between tables. The door opened with a soft jingle, but she didn't pay much attention until she saw him. Barron Trump stood by the door, his eyes scanning the room, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. There was something about him, something different. She took a step back, her heart beating faster than it should have. It wasn't that he looked out of place, but there was a quiet intensity in the way he moved, almost as if he was trying to remain unnoticed, but couldn't. His eyes caught hers, and in that brief moment, Nina felt a sudden wave of uncertainty. She quickly composed herself and walked toward him, her professional smile in place. "Hi, welcome. Can I get you something to drink while you look at the menu?" she asked, the words coming automatically, but her voice was unsteady, betraying the flutter in her chest. Barron met her gaze, nodding slightly. "Water, please," he replied, his voice calm and deliberate, yet with a hint of something she couldn't quite place. Nina turned to walk away, but something made her glance back. He hadn't moved, still standing by the door as if waiting for something. Or someone. The rest of the restaurant seemed oblivious to his presence, but Nina couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. As she went to the kitchen to fetch the water, her thoughts raced. What was it about him? The way he held himself, the way he seemed to be both part of the crowd and completely apart from it. She couldn't put her finger on it, but something told her this was no ordinary customer. She returned with the water, setting it down in front of him. Barron didn't speak at first, just nodded as he took the glass, his fingers lightly grazing the rim. There was a brief silence before he finally met her gaze again, and his voice, softer this time, broke the quiet. "Thank you," he said, his words slow and deliberate. There was something deeply sincere in them, a level of gratitude that felt unexpected, almost personal. Nina blinked, taken aback. It wasn't just a polite thank you. There was a weight behind it, something that made her pause. She gave him a tight smile, nodded, and quickly walked away, trying to shake off the lingering feeling that this moment, this encounter, was going to stay with her for much longer than she anticipated. Nina moved quickly, trying to shake off the odd feeling that lingered in her chest. She had other tables to tend to, and the lunchtime rush was only getting busier. But as she returned to Barron's table to take his order, her thoughts kept drifting back to him. There was something about the way he sat there, so still, so calm, that made it difficult to focus on anything else. When she approached, he looked up at her with those same quiet eyes, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. It was as if he wasn't in a hurry, as if he wasn't bothered by the noise or the bustle around him. It was unsettling in a way. Most customers here were chatty, asking for special requests, talking about their day. Some were demanding, others were eager to engage. But Barron, he was different. There was a stillness to him, an ease in his presence that set him apart. It wasn't arrogance or coldness, just a calm, collected air that made Nina wonder if he were even aware of how unusual it was. "What can I get you today?" she asked, hoping her voice didn't give away how curious she was. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment too long before she caught herself and glanced at her pad, ready to write down whatever he ordered. Barron glanced at the menu, as if he were deciding on a simple choice. "The special of the day," he said, his tone neutral but polite. No complaints, no extra demands, just a straightforward response. "All right," Nina replied, jotting it down quickly before turning to walk back to the kitchen. But even as she moved away, her mind kept replaying their brief interaction. It felt almost surreal. Why was he so grounded? He didn't ask for anything extra, didn't make small talk, didn't expect to be treated any differently than anyone else in the restaurant. It made Nina feel self-conscious about the way she moved through her day, the way she often leaned into small pleasantries or sought validation from customers who barely noticed the effort behind the scenes. When she returned with the food, Barron hadn't changed. He was still seated quietly, his gaze on the plate in front of him. Nina set the meal down in front of him, her hands trembling ever so slightly. It was strange. She had waited on plenty of people, some more famous, others just as anonymous. But none had made her feel this off balance. There was an air about Barron, a humility that didn't ask for attention, but commanded it nonetheless. He nodded in appreciation as she placed the plate before him. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice smooth but earnest, without any hint of obligation. It wasn't just a casual thank you. It was sincere, almost too much so. Nina blinked, feeling an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. She had been thanked 1,000 times before, but never like this. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a deep, quiet respect. As Nina stepped away from the table, she couldn't help but watch him. Barron dug into his meal, his focus entirely on the food in front of him, eating in complete silence. There was no distraction in his manner, no desire to rush. It was as if the world outside his little corner didn't exist, and all that mattered was the simple act of eating. Nina stood at the counter, her mind racing, wondering what went through his head. What was he thinking? Was this just how he always behaved? Or was there something more to this quiet presence that she couldn't quite understand? She couldn't remember the last time someone had made her pause and reflect so deeply in the midst of her hectic shift. Barron Trump, quiet, humble, grounded, had left an impression on her in a way she never expected. And for reasons she couldn't fully explain, Nina felt like she might never forget this simple encounter. The restaurant had quieted down as the last few patrons finished their meals, and Nina was finally able to catch her breath. She wiped down the counters, her body aching from hours of constant movement, when she noticed Barron getting up from his seat. He was standing near the counter now, looking down at the table with an almost reflective gaze. Nina's gaze lingered on him for a moment, before she quickly turned back to finish her task. But then something caught her eye. Barron was reaching into his pocket. For a split second, Nina thought he might be preparing to leave, but it was the way his hand moved that held her attention. His fingers, slow and deliberate, pulled out something folded. A crisp piece of paper, maybe, or a receipt. But then she saw the way he placed it on the table. She hadn't expected him to leave anything but a polite thank you, as he had before. But this was different. Her heart skipped a beat as she walked toward his table, the sounds of the restaurant fading into the background. It wasn't until she was right in front of him, ready to clear the plate, that she saw it. The tip. It wasn't just a few extra dollars or a generous roundup. It was, staggering. Nina's breath caught in her throat. She stood there for a moment, staring at the amount, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. It was more money than she made in a week. No, more than that. It was enough to cover an entire month's rent, something she had been struggling to keep up with. Her mind raced, trying to process the sudden rush of emotions flooding her. Could it be a mistake? Was this a prank? No, there was no way. She looked up at Barron, but he wasn't watching her. He had already turned toward the door, moving with that same quiet, unhurried grace. His expression was unreadable, his focus entirely on leaving. But just as he reached the door, he turned slightly, catching her eye for just a moment. A soft smile played at the corner of his lips, a smile that seemed to carry more weight than any words could. It was a knowing smile, like he understood exactly what she was thinking. There was no arrogance in it, no pride, just an unspoken kindness, a silent acknowledgement of the impact he had just made on her life. Nina's fingers trembled as she picked up the money, her heart still racing. She had worked countless shifts, served hundreds of tables, and never in all her time working here had she received such a tip. The enormity of it made her head spin. Was it real? Was she dreaming? She tried to hold back tears, her emotions threatening to spill over. It wasn't just the money, it was the act itself. The way Barron had left it there, without fanfare, without expectation. Just a simple, quiet gesture. For him, it might have been nothing. But for Nina, it was everything. She was used to struggling, always scraping by, never quite able to get ahead. And now, just like that, everything had changed. She watched him disappear into the bustling street outside, his figure melting into the crowd. But Nina didn't move. She stood frozen for a long moment, the weight of the tip pressing against her chest, as if it were a key that had unlocked something inside her. A feeling of relief, of hope, a quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, things could be different now. She placed the money in her pocket, her mind still reeling, but a spark of something brighter beginning to ignite within her. This simple gesture, this unexpected act of kindness, had changed everything. and for the first time in a long time, Nina felt like she could breathe again. Nina stood frozen by Barron's table, still gripping the crumpled receipt in her trembling hands as her mind spun wildly. The restaurant was alive with its usual chaos, the clinking of glasses and the buzz of conversations, but it all felt distant, like a muffled soundtrack to the overwhelming storm of emotions swirling inside her. She had seen the amount on the tip. She had felt it, its weight, its promise, its impossibility. She couldn't wrap her mind around it, couldn't fully accept it. And yet, there it was, real and undeniable. It wasn't just money. It was hope, a lifeline thrown at her when she hadn't even known she was drowning. But then, as she stood there, still unsure whether to laugh or cry, a voice broke through her racing thoughts. "Did you see that?" a familiar voice asked. It was Carla, one of the other waitresses who'd been working the morning shift. Nina glanced up quickly, startled. But when she saw the smile on Carla's face, she felt the weight of the situation start to settle in. "See what?" Nina managed to say, her voice shaky. "Barron Trump," Carla said, her voice filled with awe. "The guy who just left? He's Barron Trump. You know, Donald Trump's son." Nina's heart skipped a beat. The words were slow to sink in, and for a moment, she was sure she had misheard. Barron Trump? The name echoed in her mind like a distant bell, but it didn't make sense. He couldn't be. Could he? She turned toward the door, her eyes searching the street outside. The crowd had already swallowed him up, and she could only see a fleeting shadow of him as he disappeared into the distance. It was him, Barron Trump, the son of a man who could move mountains with a word, a man whose name carried more weight than anything she had ever known. Yet here he was, standing in front of her, quiet, humble, and kind. The shock of it hit her all at once. She felt her knees buckle slightly as the realization settled over her like a heavy fog. Barron Trump, the heir to a fortune, a life far beyond anything Nina could ever imagine, had walked into this small, unassuming restaurant and treated her with the kind of kindness she hadn't known in years. He didn't demand attention. He didn't expect anything special. He simply gave, and he gave more than she ever could have imagined. Her hands began to tremble as her mind flooded with memories of her own struggles. The bills piled up every month, the late-night worries about how to make ends meet, the constant pressure to keep going, even when she felt like she was running on empty. She had spent so many days wondering if things would ever get better, wondering if she was simply stuck in an endless cycle. And then, this. Barron's simple act had shifted something deep inside her. She felt an overwhelming rush of admiration for Barron, for his generosity, and strangely, for herself, because in this moment, she realized something she hadn't before. His kindness wasn't just about the money. It was about the reminder that even in a world so often driven by wealth and power, there was still room for simple, heartfelt humanity. He had seen her, in a way that felt like a gift, one that was beyond any material value. Nina let out a slow, shaky breath as she stared at the empty table where Barron had sat. She felt humbled, overwhelmed by the quiet power of his generosity. She wasn't sure how she would process all of this, but one thing was certain. This moment, this brief encounter had the power to change her life. The tip wasn't just a financial relief, it was a turning point. A spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. As Nina turned back to the counter, she glanced at the money in her pocket. A small but powerful shift had taken place in her heart. The bills, the struggles, the endless grind, it all seemed a little more bearable now. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that kindness, in its purest form, could make all the difference. Nina stepped outside the restaurant, her legs carrying her to a quiet bench on the edge of the sidewalk, though she hardly felt like she was moving at all. The world around her continued on, people hustling, cars honking, street vendors shouting. But in that moment, it was all a blur. She didn't hear the noise, didn't see the bustling life that continued, as if nothing had changed. Because for her, something had changed. Something deep inside her heart had shifted, and she wasn't sure how to comprehend it yet. She sat down slowly, pulling the crumpled receipt out of her pocket, her hands still trembling. Barron's tip was more than she had ever imagined anyone would leave her, more than she had ever dreamed possible. But it wasn't just the money that took her breath away. It was the kindness behind it, the sincerity, the quiet act of generosity from someone who could have easily walked into any restaurant and demanded attention, yet chose instead to quietly, almost humbly, give without expectation. She stared at the tip, the weight of it still sinking in. Could Barron have known what this would mean to her? Did he realize how much this simple gesture would impact her life? Did he know that she had been drowning in bills, struggling to keep up, and now, just like that, she had a lifeline? Or was it truly just a random act of kindness, an impulsive decision that had no deeper meaning than what was on the surface? The question swirled around her, but what she felt most was gratitude. It was more than just relief. It was awe. Barron had seen her. He hadn't known her story, hadn't known the late nights she spent wondering how she would pay her rent, or how she felt invisible sometimes, lost in the endless cycle of work with nothing to show for it. But he had seen her in that moment. He had recognized something in her that made him choose to give, to offer something without asking for anything in return. Nina felt tears well up in her eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. She wasn't sure why she was crying. Was it because of the unexpected kindness? Or because it made her realize just how much she had been neglecting herself in the struggle to survive? She didn't have all the answers. But one thing was certain. She was different now. Barron's act had ignited something inside her, something she had buried under layers of stress and exhaustion. She took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. And as she exhaled, something inside her clicked. She didn't want to just accept this kindness and let it fade into memory. She wanted to pass it on. Barron had shown her the power of a simple, selfless act, and now she was determined to do the same. She wanted to pay it forward, to help someone else the way he had helped her, to show them that kindness, no matter how small, could change everything. With a new sense of purpose, Nina stood up from the bench, the weight of the tip still in her pocket but no longer feeling heavy. It felt like a symbol of hope, of possibility. She wasn't just going to survive anymore. She was going to live with intention. She was going to make a difference in someone's life, just as Barron had done in hers. And as she walked back toward the restaurant, a quiet smile played on her lips. The world hadn't changed. She had. Barron's kindness had sparked a shift inside her, and now she was ready to spread that same light. The next day, Nina walked into the restaurant, her steps slower than usual, as if she were still floating in the haze of the previous day's events. The moment she stepped through the door, something felt different. It wasn't just the hum of the busy kitchen or the ringing phone in the back. It was the weight of Barron's generosity still pressing on her heart. His kindness had ignited something deep within her, something she wasn't sure she was ready to fully understand. As soon as Nina's coworkers saw her, they crowded around her, eager to hear about the previous day. The buzz in the air was palpable. Everyone had heard whispers of the young man who had left such a generous tip. "What happened?" Carla asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. "You weren't kidding about that tip, were you?" Nina took a breath, glancing at her coworkers, feeling the same mix of disbelief and awe that had overtaken her since the moment Barron had left. She couldn't stop thinking about him, about the silent, powerful kindness he had shown her. I don't know how to explain it," Nina began, her voice soft but steady. "He came in, ordered the special, barely said a word, just sat there like any other customer. And then, when he finished his meal, he left this." She paused for a moment, holding up the crumpled receipt, her fingers brushing over the figures written on it. Her hands were steady now, but the emotional flood she had been holding back still simmered beneath the surface. "He left me a tip, a huge one, more than I make in a month," she continued, her voice tinged with disbelief. "And he didn't expect anything in return. He didn't ask for special treatment. He just gave." The silence in the room was thick as Nina's words sank in. Her coworkers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief. "Why would he do that?" Carla asked, her voice filled with wonder. "I mean, what kind of person just gives like that?" Nina didn't have an answer. She didn't know Barron, didn't know what had driven him to leave such a generous tip. But what she did know, what she had felt with every fiber of her being, was that his kindness wasn't about the money. It was about seeing someone in need, seeing their struggle and responding with empathy. "It wasn't just the money," Nina said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "It was the fact that he saw me. He saw that I've been struggling. Maybe he didn't know the details, but he knew something. And that made all the difference." Her co-workers stood there, silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Then Carla spoke, her tone reverent. "That's something, Nina. That's something we all could learn from." And in that moment, Nina realized something she hadn't fully understood before. Kindness wasn't about the amount. It was the intention behind it. Barron's gesture had been a reminder that there was still goodness in the world, still people who cared enough to give without expecting anything in return. And Nina was determined to keep that lesson alive, to pass on the kindness that had changed her life. Weeks passed since that life-changing moment, and Nina's world slowly began to shift. The weight of the bills, the late-night anxieties that used to keep her awake, slowly started to lift. Barron's unexpected act of kindness had sparked something within her, something that was changing her, transforming her in ways she hadn't yet fully understood. It wasn't just the money or the relief of one less worry on her shoulders. It was the way it made her feel seen. For the first time in what felt like forever, Nina felt a sense of calm that wasn't fleeting, but real. She was breathing easier now, not just because of the financial cushion Barron had given her, but because his kindness had awakened something inside her heart, a spark of hope that had been long extinguished. She found herself doing things she hadn't thought to do before, small acts of kindness that seemed insignificant, but meant the world to others. One afternoon, as she was leaving work, she passed a homeless man on the street corner. He looked tired, worn down by the world, and there was a soft desperation in his eyes. Normally, Nina would have hurried past him, her mind too wrapped up in her own concerns. But this time, she stopped. She walked up to him, and without a word, pulled a sandwich and coffee from her bag, something she hadn't planned, but something she just felt compelled to do. "Here," she said quietly, her voice filled with a tenderness she hadn't realized she was capable of. "Take this. I hope your day gets better." The man's face lit up with a look of surprise, gratitude, and a deep kind of relief. "Thank you," he whispered, and Nina saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a small moment of hope, much like the one Barron had given her. It wasn't about the food. It was about acknowledging someone else's humanity, offering a piece of kindness when it was least expected. It felt good. It felt right. As the weeks went on, Nina continued to make small gestures like that. She listened more attentively when a friend needed to talk. She helped an elderly neighbor carry groceries. Each act felt like a ripple, small at first, but powerful in its reach. And with each act, Nina realized something profound. Kindness wasn't about grand gestures, about sweeping actions that changed the world overnight. It was about the small, consistent moments where you saw the humanity in others and chose to act with compassion, no matter how small the gesture might seem. She thought about Barron often, about that moment when he had quietly left the restaurant, changing her life without asking for anything in return. It had started as something so simple, just a tip, but it had turned into a lesson she would carry with her forever. He had shown her that even the smallest acts of kindness could change the course of someone's day, their life. And she understood now that kindness had a ripple effect that extended far beyond what was visible. Nina stood at her window one evening, looking out over the city as the sun set behind the buildings. The weight of everything she had been carrying, the uncertainty, the financial struggles, the isolation, had melted away, replaced by a quiet hope she hadn't known in years. The tip had been more than just a financial gesture. It had been a call to action, a reminder that the power of kindness was far greater than any obstacle. With a soft smile on her lips, Nina realized that Barron's act hadn't just changed her circumstances. It had opened a new chapter in her life, one filled with purpose and connection. She was no longer just surviving. She was living with intention, spreading kindness wherever she went. And she knew, deep down, that every act of kindness, no matter how small, could ignite a change in someone else. As Nina stepped away from the window, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. A new beginning had begun, and it all started with one person, one unexpected moment of generosity. Now think about your own life. What small act of kindness can you offer today? It doesn't have to be grand. Sometimes the simplest gestures are the ones that have the biggest impact. Like Barron's act that changed Nina's life, your kindness can create a ripple effect, touching lives in ways you may never know. So take a moment to pause, look around, and make someone's day a little brighter. You never know the difference your actions could make.